So we've decided to just adopt the FinOps terminology to make it easier for organizations that are planning to execute FinOps and ITAM together. Gartner predicted that, I believe it was by 2025 or 2026, over 50% of their organization will have converged their ITAM and FinOps functions. And we're certainly seeing that kind of trend. And so having one standard that's aligned with both methodology would, I believe, go a long way to doing that.
Welcome to another episode of the ITAM Executive. I'm Kris Johnson, Chief Product Officer at Anglepoint. With me is someone who needs little introduction in the ITAM industry, Ron Brill, not only President and Chairman of Anglepoint, but convener of WG21 that writes the 19770 family of standards within ISO IEC. Ron is also the Vice Chair of the ITAM Forum, as well as the co-lead for the FinOps Foundation Special Interest Group for FinOps and ITAM. Have I got those right, Ron?
Yeah, you got those right.
All right.
Great to be here.
I thought we'd spend some time today talking about something that you and I have worked very heavily on, and that was just presented by you, Ron, to the interim WG21 meeting hosted here at Anglepoint in Linden, Utah. And that is the 2024 update to 19770-1. And there's a lot of new evolutions to the standard. We've certainly seen a lot of evolution since its first iteration many, many years ago that we both worked on, and many others, of course, contributed to. And one of the fundamental changes that we saw in the last update was an evolution from a SAM standard to an ITAM standard, but also the adoption of the ISO construct of a management system, which exists in many other ISO standards, now formally adopted into -1, and now updated in the 2024 edition, which will come out for initial ballot within WG21 here fairly shortly. But I thought we'd spend some time talking about the management system, because the management system is sort of an ISO construct, and how it's written is sort of an ISO speak. It's a bit of an esoteric language, if you will, that certain words have operative meanings that aren't necessarily obvious to a casual reader of the ISO standard. And to really understand it, you really have to understand how the management system works, which is becoming more and more relevant now that we have a certification authority against the ISO standard, and organizations that may have some desire to certify against the standard. You have to know what the management system is and how it works and what it means. So Ron, maybe you can start by giving our listeners a introduction to the management system.
Sure, of course. So management system standards, or MSS for short, is a concept that ISO has adopted a number of years ago, and that they use across a wide range of standard types. It's based on the Deming cycle of continuous improvement, the Plan, Do, Check, Act, or PDCA. Deming was a industrial engineer, I believe, who kind of in the middle of the last century, he helped the Japanese economy a lot after the Second World War. And people who are familiar with concepts like Lean Six Sigma and so forth are very familiar with that concept. Plan, Do, Check, Act is really about how do you continuously improve anything, any kind of structure or set of processes and so forth. And the reason why ISO started moving to management system standards that use the PDCA concept is because the alternative, what is the alternative to that? The alternative would be to have standards that are very prescriptive. Mm-hmm. So if ITAM was not a management system standard, then the ITAM standard would have had to specify very specifically what organization needs to do and not do, for example, you shall reconcile your Oracle licenses once a quarter or whatever. And there are two problems with that. One problem is that each organization is different, right? So you can't really have a one-size-fits-all. What's right for one organization may be insufficient for another, and may be an overkill for a third organization that's much smaller, right? So you can't really do that. And then it also does not allow for change and continuous improvement, right? So if there's a new technology that comes out tomorrow that represents new risks, well, if you're set to be compliant with a rigid standard, then you're not going to be able to respond to it as much as you can. And so it's actually good analogies, like, the saying, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man how to fish, you feed him for a life. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of based on a similar structure where instead of being prescriptive to organization, telling them exactly what they need to do, we're telling them how to think about what they need to do, how to arrive at their own conclusions of what they need to do, and then how to make sure that they actually do it in a way that is verifiable, and that they check that it's operating as expected, that they correct if it's not operating as expected, and so forth. So in the PDCA cycle, you have 4 phases. In the plan phase, you would essentially understand the context of the organization, the objectives of the organization, who the stakeholders are, what their requirements are. You will conduct a risk assessment. And then based on that whole thing, you will understand what your scope is. Scope as far as what assets should be in scope for the IT asset management program. Not just types of assets, but like what business units and divisions, locations, and so forth. And then you also decide what processes need to be in scope. And again, that scope of the assets and the processes is really based on your risk assessment, on the requirements of your stakeholders and the needs of your organization. And so you do that in the plan phase. Again, it's very tailored to the organization. And then the next phase is the do phase, where you essentially execute the processes. And the third stage is the check. You're checking that the processes are operating as you expected. Essentially, you're doing monitoring, you're doing auditing, and so forth. And then finally, the act phase is where you take steps to correct any deviations or non-conformity that you've identified in the check phase, right? If there's an issue, you fix it, and then you go right back to planning, right? It's a continuous improvement cycle. You're never really done, right? And so the next time you do the risk assessment, you may conclude that you need to add certain types of assets to your scope, or you need to add a process or remove a process that's no longer relevant, or modify an objective for one of your processes, right? So it's a continuous improvement cycle, and the idea is that you go through that cycle, but with each iteration of that cycle, you get a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. You're kind of spiraling towards continuous improvement, and that's the concept of a management system. And again, I believe it's much better because you're not prescribing what you can do for ITAM. You're teaching them how to think through that and how to execute on that. And the content is going to be different for each organization. There are many ISO standards that follow that structure, like 27,001 for information security, 20,001 for service management, 9,001 for quality management, 14,001 for environmental management system, and there's like many of them. And the nice thing about them, if you understand how one of them is structured, you understand all of them, because in all the standards that I've mentioned and many others, the sections are exactly the same. So sections 4 through 7 are always going to be the plan. Section 8 is always going to be the do. Section 9 is always going to be the check. Section 10 is always going to be the act. So if you know how to read one of them, you can read all of them. And so that's one advantage. The other advantage is that they're meant to be jointly implemented. Right? So you can have one management system that addresses the needs of multiple standards. And in fact, when the current version of -1 was written, the use case that was anticipated is a joint implementation with 27,001 for information security.
I remember when I first understood this concept of a management system and how it works. It really resonated with me because it's been probably over 10 years now. I remember speaking at a conference at that time, it was an early version of the definition of software asset management according to an early version of ITIL. And it was something to the effect of all the people, process, and technology necessary to manage all assets through all phases of their life cycle. And on the surface of it, that sounds all fine and good, but when you really think about it, nobody under that definition is doing software asset management, because no one is doing all the people, process, and technology necessary to manage all software assets through all stages of their life cycle. And they probably shouldn't, right? Because that sets such a high bar. It's very prescriptive, like you said, that there's a point of diminishing marginal returns, right? Where an organization needs to decide what is important for them to manage, which assets and which stages of the life cycle and which processes and which parts, right, are relevant for them. And the management system gives that flexibility where you align it to your organizational objectives, as you mentioned, to your stakeholder objectives, define what's important for you, the processes that you have in scope, right? It provides a framework for you to, select processes from to have within, sort of your on your radar, but isn't overly prescriptive that to do IT asset management, you have to do these things, right? It's more create a system that prioritizes effective management of the things that your organization values, and then put that in a system of incremental improvement to make sure that it's functioning well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you can, by the way, organizations can find a lot of value in the standard, even if they're not going for certification, right? Just because it's a really good structure and it's a framework that's proven itself, many times over across many different disciplines to be highly effective. But if you are going through a certification process, then what the auditor would look for is to see evidence that you've actually went through the process, the plan, do, check, act, right? So they'll want to see a risk assessment. They'll want to see what the conclusions from a risk assessment is. They want to see that those conclusions and that risk assessment was signed off by management.
Yeah.
They want to see how you've defined your scope and that it matches the risk assessment, that it's in line with it. They'll want to see that you've selected the right processes based on that, and they'll want to see that you're executing them, that you're evidence that you're checking that they're operating. So show me how you're checking that they're operating effectively and so forth. So again, they won't care about what the content is, whether you've decided that whatever publisher XYZ should be in scope or no. They don't care about that. What they will care is that you have a process to determine that and that you've actually followed your own process.
Yeah. So not focusing on what you're choosing to manage, but focusing on, do you have a system and a process to effectively manage what you choose to manage?
Yes, that's a good way to describe it. Yeah.
And so, what can our listeners anticipate with the 2024 release? What advancements are coming to the ISO standard later next year?
Yeah, there's a number of very exciting changes that we're working on that we just discussed within the committee. One of them is we're aligning the IT asset management standard with FinOps, with the FinOps methodology. So for those of you who remember the current version of the standard, the 2017 version, it had 3 tiers: trustworthy data, lifecycle integration, and optimization. And for those of you familiar with the FinOps methodology, that one has 3 phases as well, but they're worded a little differently, right? It's inform, optimize, and operate. And you can see that they're kind of similar, right? So inform, it's kind of like trustworthy data. Operate is kind of like lifecycle integration, and optimization is like optimize, right? So it's kind of similar, but they were using different terminologies and so forth. So we've decided to just adopt the FinOps terminology to make it easier for organizations that are planning to execute FinOps and ITAM together. Gartner predicted that I believe it was by 2025 or 2026, over 50% of their organization will have converged their ITAM and FinOps functions. And we're certainly seeing that kind of trend. And so having one standard that's aligned with both methodology would, I believe, go a long way to doing that. So that's one change that we've done. Other changes are, for example, we are adding a lot of process mm-hmm. areas. Mm-hmm. And the way it works, it's in an annex that the organization can, based on the risk assessment, choose from. But the list is much, much longer. So we went up from 15 process areas in the current version to nearly 30, 29 or 30 in the 2024 version. Yeah. And we've been able to add a lot more granularity for things that ITAM and FinOps functions do every day, mm-hmm. Which we believe will really help a lot to get a better tailor fit to what organizations actually need to implement. Yeah. And one other example is that we were able to add things like sustainability. So because we're as a process yeah. area, so for the first time, again, that's a very hot topic within IT asset management and FinOps nowadays with GreenOps. And we are adding this as it's all on separate process area. Yeah. We also kind of streamlined the standard a bit more. There are some observations and feedback that we've received from the first organizations that went through certification. So we actually received feedback from the auditing firm that has done these audits and certified those organizations. Say, well, this here is not very clear, or can you clarify that, or this and this looks duplicate. Can you clarify how if they are in fact duplicate or not? So we got some good feedback just by organizations going through the certification that we've incorporated in this new version. So I'm really excited about this new version being much better aligned to support kind of the future trends that we're seeing in the industry.
Something else that I think is worth mentioning, evolution from a standard standpoint, is the inclusion of cloud resources as an IT asset, which again further creates alignment with the FinOps methodology. So I think this is a great. If we look at the first iteration of the standard, going back many years, right, starting with software asset management, then under your leadership, it grew to include IT asset management, and now has grown again to, and aligned to ISO 27000, like you mentioned, and now has grown to include cloud resources as an IT asset management to almost be more technology asset management more broadly. So I think it's a great evolution of the standard, that it's evolving with the industry and not staying stagnant and living in obscurity. I think it helps take it out of obscurity to align it to 27000, to align it to the FinOps foundation methodology and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the current version that was in 2017 actually does include cloud assets. However, I know that hasn't been very clear to a lot of people, and certainly the 2024 version is more specific about that IT assets can really be any technology that are either paid for by the organization or deployed by the organization or used for the organization. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter if it's on-prem or off-prem or in the cloud. It doesn't matter if it's
licensable or not,
if it's CapEx or OpEx. None of these things really matter.
Operational or informational.
Exactly. None of these things really matter. All these things that are all IT assets that need to be managed. And so we clarified that a bit, but it was already in the intention of the current 2017 version. It just wasn't perhaps very clear to some people.
Yeah.
Sure.
When do we anticipate the standard being available for public review for the second ballot?
So we're finalizing the draft within the committee. Then it goes to a first ballot. So it goes to all the ISO member countries to vote on. We take their feedback, and then we we do a second ballot. And so that's kind of the process. Sometimes, in some cases, depending on the results of the second ballot, we may need to go to the third ballot or not. It really depends on how the voting goes. I believe the first ballot should be ready within, I would say, Q1 of 2024. The second ballot, maybe 6 months after that.
Yeah.
We're going to try to do what we can to accelerate it, but it's not always possible in the ISO universe. But
yeah. I mean, you've presented your first draft at this interim WG21 meeting in mid-November, right, to 2023. So, I think that just speaks to kind of the time that it takes to go through the proper approvals and gain consensus within the industry. So hopefully we can get it in to publication by end of 2024.
Yeah. That's our goal. It's doable.
But that's having submitted it a year in advance. So.
Yeah. That's right. It's, ISO definitely, they operate in certain ways. There are a lot of standards for writing standards. It's a country membership organization, so all countries need to vote on it, and then they need to be able to have time to disseminate the drafts to their members and receive the drafts in time and so forth. So each round of ballots takes months, right? Mm-hmm. We want to give everyone a chance to review and provide comments, and then ISO needs to get the results and aggregate them and so forth. So those things take time.
If one of our listeners is interested in participating in that ballot process and even in that first ballot process as a member of WG21, what do they need to do?
So anyone who has an interest to join WG21, feel free to just reach out to me. And I will point them to the right place. Essentially, the way it works, only countries can nominate delegates to participate in ISO committees. So the person will need to be nominated as a delegate by the country where they live and work, not necessarily the country where they have citizenship, but it's really kind of where they live and work. And so I can point the person to the national standards body in that country and provide the contact information, and they can work from there. Different countries have different processes for accepting delegates and so forth. So there's sometimes some of them require membership within the local national standards body. Some of them don't. So it really varies. But if you have an interest to be part of this work of creating standards for the industry, that's absolutely great. We're always looking for more people, more perspectives. Just reach out to me and I'll connect you with the right people so you can find out what that means for you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Ron, for taking this time, and hopefully this has been beneficial to our listeners, and lots of good things on their way from a development standpoint in evolving the standard and continuing to make it relevant within an ever-evolving industry. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris.